G'day there folks, I'm Beanie, you're watching Beanie Draws, and by now you've probably seen that adorable little clip of Owen patting Baby Blue. Or is it Baby Blue? Is it Baby Blue, or is it the baby of Blue? I guess all will be revealed in time, but all that aside, when I saw that clip I thought to myself, you bet your butt I have to draw this. The only problem was I wasn't sure if I was going to do it as a tutorial or if I was going to keep it as a time-lapse speed drawing. But then I figured everyone's going to probably want to know how to draw it, so I've done my best to try and explain how I went about drawing this picture. Now to start off drawing Baby Blue's head, what you're going to need to do is sketch out the shape of its head. I found that drawing an egg shape was perfect for this. I did a little bit of a circle around its nose and a circle around its eye socket to give you a bit of a basic proportion placement, as well as drawing a line in the back for the jaw. After doing that, I finished drawing out the rough placement for the back of the head, the lower part of the jaw, and then I started sketching in the loose placement for the throat. Using the size of the head and also looking at my reference image, I then roughed out a very loose shape for the neck. Of course, it's going to be refined more, but this is a very loose sketch to start off with. And then after that, I started drawing some of the curved lines for the back of the ear, the top of the back of the head, and the back of the jaw. You'll notice from the original reference image that there's a bunch of little lines coming around the flexing of the neck, so I'm drawing those in as well. And then I started drawing a bit of the eyebrow ridge, loosely drawing in some of the beginning lines for the eye shape, and starting to draw in a bit of the lines for the nasal passage. Now that I've got the loose placement of everything, I'm going to start refining and start sculpting the shape of the actual skull and head. But because I couldn't fully make out the shape of Blue's mouth from the source image used, I kind of had to guess and use my own imagination to try and figure out what the actual shape of the mouth was looking like. So after placing a few basic lines to try and get the shape of the mouth, I decided to start working more on refining the jaw, and I figured that would probably help me get the shape of the mouth right. And while I did that, I further refined the lines for underneath Baby Blue's throat and underneath its chin. I took that refinement and I continued it along the tip of its snout, where I started drawing its nostril hole as well. Then I continued to work out the shape of the front lips and the snout, and then I started to refine the shape of the snout and the top of the head more. After that, we'll add in more detail for the back of the head, as well as adding more detail in for the eye socket and eyebrow ridge. We'll take this opportunity to shape out the back of the head and the neck a little bit more. And you'll notice from this point on, it's really just about refining, adding lines, reshaping lines, sculpting, and treating this much like a sculpture now, because you can pretty much see the shape of it now. We're just adding lines here and there to make it really defined. Usually what I do is I'll use the initial lines that I've drawn, and then I'll refine and sculpt those lines to make them look even more angular, adding a little bit more of an angle or a curve here and there, just like you see at the back of the head and the corner of the jaw. We'll take that refinement process and we'll apply it also to the eye socket and the eye shape. And you'll see that I use several lines to carefully craft out the shape of the eyelids. Once that's done, we start to begin drawing out the shape of Baby Blue's blue stripe. Very much like drawing out the shape of the head to begin with, it's very loose and it's just basically blocking out the initial shape. It gives you a very loose, very rough idea of what the initial image will look like, and then you can refine it even further, like you can see what I'm doing now with its throat and the bottom of its jaw. And then once you got that done, you can refine it even more, like I'm doing with its chin and the tip of its snout. And that's basically the whole process to drawing. You gradually refine more and more, like I'm doing with the mouth, and you get even more refined. You observe, see if it's going the way you want it, and if you think a few lines need to be tweaked, you tweak them. And with every adjusted line, you add even more detail to the overall image. And as I start adding more detail, you're going to start noticing that I'm using shadows, blocks of shading, blocks of rendering, blocks of black to get more details out there, because at this point it's not just about the detail of the actual lines, it's about the detail of the shading as well. But before we get into full on colour and shading detail, we'll draw in Baby Blue's pupil so she can see her bright future ahead of her. And now that we've given her the ability to see, we'll continue adding even more detail into her stripe. I'm also at this point starting to draw in little outlines that will indicate the splotches of colour in her skin, because at this point I was still not really planning on doing this in colour. Instead I was mainly just wanting to do this in black and white, so I thought blocking in tones of skin colour would just be enough to give that detail that I was wanting. So I continued to use shading and darkness as a way of forming contrast between the stripe and the rest of her skin. And I'll be doing a lot of that from here on. I'm not going to really be talking much more about the detail unless it's appropriate. I'm mainly going to be talking about my process of rendering, like around the eye, which is a really important area to be shading. You can see here that I'm using a big block of shading to emphasize contrast between the eye socket and the eyelid. I'm also using that shading to really emphasize the difference between the stripe pattern and the rest of her skin, because you'll notice that her stripe is very dominant, and it seems to be divided by the rest of her with a bit of a white outline, so I'm using a lot of black to emphasize that white outline. After giving her eyelid a bit of shading, I'm also going to now work throughout the whole entire stripe, adding a bit of darkness to kind of maybe make it look a little bit more like it's coloured, but in the end, I just end up colouring it anyway. I started off with a darker blue for baby blue stripe, and added a new layer underneath the black so I could add the colour without worrying about going over the black. If you're doing this traditionally, however, that won't work. And you'll see now, as I add a wash of blue throughout blue stripe, that's a lot of blue by the way, that the blue appears under the black and the black retains its detail. If you were to do this traditionally, you just have to re-go over the blue with black. Or start off with just blue and then add the black detailing over the top later. Now I've applied that pass of blue very lightly because now I'm going to add another colour, and I'm going to be doing that throughout the whole image. With this pass, we're adding a bit more of an aqua vibe to the blue. We want it to be a little bit greener. And then we're going to go back to the black. And when you're doing this digitally, you want to make sure you're on the right layer, because you don't want to accidentally put the wrong color in the wrong layer, because then the luxuries of digital go out the window, and you may as well be doing this traditionally. Now that we've got that started, we're going to go back to using some of the black splotches and laying out some black shading, and we're also going to start putting in a little bit of the detail in the scales. Now my approach towards the scales this time isn't going to be my usual detailed form, it's going to be more of an impressionistic style. So I'm going to be laying down the basic scales, but not doing too many of them. The whole point of Impressionism is to lay down the impression of the detail, not the actual detail itself. Once we've got that started, we'll go back into using the black for more of the contrast and shading, and also applying some of the basic skin texture. After that, we're going to readjust some of the lines for the back of the jaw, and then we're going to add some shading behind the nostril, adding a little bit of detail around it, and then we're actually going to reshape it by erasing it and then redrawing it with a more refined shape. After that, we're going to add even more impressionistic scales around its snout area. And as you can see from the screen cap image that I took, there's not a huge amount of detail to work with, so a lot of this is up to artistic interpretation. Like for example, in the original source image, you can see these darker blotches in the skin, so I'm trying to replicate that with blotches of shading. And then I'm going to continue with those blotches of shading, and I'm going to continue throughout the image adding darker areas of black, light areas of black, speckling them throughout the skin. And you'll see that's pretty much how I build up the detail from this point on. It's going to be very impressionistic, kind of like a painting, adding more and more splotches of black to build up that skin texture. Also, as I get further along with this image, you'll notice that I'm going to be removing lines, I'm going to be cutting into the image, I'm going to be adding and refining all the details, so like the snout, I'm erasing a lot of the lines and reshaping the shape. And then I'm going back into using splotches of shading to build up even more of that skin texture, and that's pretty much how I develop the rest of this image. I'll build up some of the skin texture, I'll refine some of the detail, build up even more of the skin texture, build up more of the detail, and I just keep going at that until I'm ready to start laying down the colour. So here's even more detail, laying down some of the spikes that run along her neck, and also going to be drawing along some of those lines that indicate the folds of the back of her neck. Building up more shading and detail in the neck. And because the lower jaw is looking a little bit plain and empty when compared to the top part of her head, I'm going to draw in a series of scales along her lower jaw so it's more balanced visually with the top part of her head. After that, I'm going to loosely block in the placement of Owen's hand. I've basically just drawn in the index finger and one of the lower fingers, and then yet again, I'm adding even more detail throughout the image. Now up until this point, I thought I was just going to be keeping it to like a grayscale black and white with a blue highlight, but then I started to think, you know what, Let's just go for it. Let's color in the eye and the rest of blue as well. I've gone with an orange because that's the color of the eye. And then I start a new layer so I can keep the eye, the blue stripe, and the grey layers separated from each other. And then I start to proceed coloring in the rest of the eye. So now that we've got the eye done, I figure we might as well do the rest of the colouring as well. So I've started a new layer for colouring in her skin, and then we're going to start off with a bit of a brown colour, but we're also going to have a few different browns in there and a few greys and beiges as well. My approach to colouring is going to be very much the same as my approach to shading and rendering. I'm going to be building up the colours, building up the layers of each colour throughout the image, and changing the colour where I need to, because the colour isn't uniform throughout the image. Some areas are kind of more pale, some areas are darker as you can see from the reference image in the corner there, and some of the areas are more orangey and patchy. Then I solidify and add more detail into blue stripe. And then with a really pale beige colour, as well as adding in a new layer, I begin to add in some of the highlights and shine for Blue's eye, as well as drawing in some scales using white, which I find is a nice way to add in some extra highlights and details. I continue doing this down the neck by adding some white squiggly lines, and I essentially do this throughout the rest of the image, as well as along the throat and the top of the head. And I find that speckling white along the top of the head, along the eyebrow ridge and along the neck really helps to emphasize some of those scales being hit by the light. And I continue to do this throughout the rest of the snout, along the jaw and the back of the neck. It's a new technique that I've really been experimenting with, and I found it adds a lot of extra little detail without going too overboard. Now that we've got that done, I'm starting to lay down the background layer with a large wax pastel brush. You can really use anything that you want, but I went with a pastel brush because I like the texture that it leaves. Also, keep in mind, if you're doing this traditionally, you want to be careful around the edges so that you don't make a mess, and if you're doing this digitally, keep your background layer on the lowest layer and it'll help keep everything tidy. Then I'm going to add some blue to the background, and keep in mind that green is made from yellow and blue, so you can use that to adjust your green where you want. Then, after adding a light layer of blue over the green, I'm going to pick a sort of a dried grass kind of yellow. And as I work on the background, I'm going to be going in between the blues, going between the yellows, kind of finding a nice balance between the two. And as I further refine the amount of blue throughout the image, you'll notice that there's an overspray of color over the head. So I'm going to get the eraser tool and I'm going to erase some of that so the highlights of the head still show up. Then in a new layer, I'm going to select a color somewhere around the orangey pinkish realm for the color of Owen's glove. When I'm working on his glove, I'm going to be building up in layers. Sometimes I'm going to be doing a bit of an edge like you can see here, and other times I'm going to be building up blocks of color. So bit by bit, it's going to be a combination of those two techniques. Lines and color blocking. Then I'm going to select a paler version of that color and I'm going to start putting in the highlights of the hand. And to contrast with the highlights, we're going to use a darker color for the shadow underneath the fingers and for the knuckles. I'm going to continue using that shadow color to emphasize the slightly tilted nature of his hand, and I'm also going to apply that shading to the fingers. And because few things in life are rarely one flat color, I'm going to add a little bit of orange to add to that rubber of his glove. And because some of that orange has made the hand look a bit flat again, I'm going to make a bit of a darker orange to emphasize the shadows in the knuckles. I'm also starting to see that the difference between orange and brown can be very similar. And from this point on, we're going to be using a combination of those lighter and darker tones to really refine the shape of the glove. And I'm also using those lighter colors to emphasize the wrinkles. And now while I have used darker tones to emphasize the shadows, I'm also going to use some black outlines to just really emphasize the shape. And because I drew baby blue with pencil, it also works as some visual balance to draw the hand with pencil as well. Then after that, I add an extra layer of glow to the top of his glove, much like the same as the top of the head. And because the bottom of Blue's chin is looking way too dark, I'm going to lighten that up as well. And from this point on, I'm basically just going to be tidying up the image now, adding some extra detail here and there, erasing some of the lines, adding some lines, just basically touching up the last few bits. And as we now draw closer to the end of the image, I thought that the neck could probably do with a little extra detail. I was initially going to leave it plain and have the detail mainly in the head and progressively less detail the further out in the image, but then I decided I think I want more detail in the neck. I want the whole entire image to be completed, so I decided to go and do more detail in the stripe. So it's very much the same as how I did it before. And the more I look at it, the more the shapes in the stripe actually look kind of like a giraffe. So you got that main stripe and you've also got those splotches of giraffe shaped patterns. And as we finish up the last few little bits of detail, we're going to pull back out of the image now and observe our results. So as Drawer with Jazza would say, I really like the way that turned out. And if you really like the way that turned out, why don't you smash that like button, hit the bell notification when you subscribe if you liked it and you want to see even more of this content. If you followed along and you've drawn your own version, why don't you send me a copy to beaniedrawers@hotmail.com or tag me on Instagram @beanarts, and I'll be sure to add you in a future shoutout video. And if you want to check out even more of my videos, here's some selections I picked out just for you. Otherwise, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Cheerio for now.